we're live. Thank you. All right, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Today, I'll be talking to you guys about thoughts and catching them if we can. So before we get started, I just want to let you know that today's webinar is simply for educational purposes. And the things that I'm talking to you about today are not meant to replace any advice that you've received from your own healthcare provider. Today, we'll be doing a quick webinar where I will be talking to you about what it is to be a bad parent. I'm also going to teach you a technique called cognitive restructuring, which is a way to help us challenge our irrational thoughts. Thank you, Smile, for inviting me again. I spoke to the Smile audience a couple of weeks ago. For those of you who didn't tune in last time, my name is Adam Ghemraoui, and I'm a clinical and school psychologist based out of Ontario. And I work with kids and adults. And my practice with kids involves assessing children for disabilities, as well as providing therapy and intervention services. A lot of my work also involves working with parents. And the number one thing that I see when I work with parents is that they come with a lot of shame. And I have to clarify that shame is not the same idea that we have from a religious perspective, where it's bashfulness, or in Arabic, it's haya. Shame from a psychological perspective is ideas that we have about ourselves that we are bad. So it could be I'm incompetent, meaning I can't do something, or I'm not worthy of my role, so I shouldn't be a parent. And shame is not the same thing as guilt. So while shame is ideas about ourselves that we are bad, guilt is feeling bad about doing something. So for example, I don't hand in my homework on time, I feel guilty. And this feeling of guilt is actually a good feeling. It teaches us to learn from our mistakes. It teaches us to avoid certain things. And it's okay to feel guilty about something that we've done. Whereas shame is not about a thing that we've done, rather it's about ourselves as individuals. So for example, when I see my son tantrum, I may have a thought that tells me, wow, Adam, you are such a bad parent. You call yourself a psychologist, yet your own son tantrums. So it's really important that we distinguish shame from guilt. And as I go through my presentation today, I'll be talking a lot about shame. So why is it important to know about shame? Shame can lead to different styles of parenting. A lot of times I see families come in who engage in what I call overcompensatory parenting, which means they're trying to make up for something. Now, what we know is that every parent has shame. What we also know is that whenever there is a special need, the shame in parents increases. So we expect parents of children that have disabilities to have more shame. And we actually think that shame starts from before the child is even born. We have ideas about ourselves as parents. So you can imagine a parent who has a child with a disability may feel so terrible that this happened to their child. How could this have happened? What did I do? This is my fault. And what ends up happening is in these parents is they want to compensate for that. Meaning, well, my child had a terrible, pregnancy, or sorry, my baby struggled as a newborn. As a toddler, I will do everything in my power to make sure he or she is happy. And you might think, well, Adam, that's pretty good that we want to make our kids happy. What's the issue with that? And the problem with overcompensating for difficult experiences is that you never teach the child to be resilient. They never learn to tolerate difficult emotions like anger or sadness or disgust. And so what ends up happening is parents that feel bad, they think that, they're to be blamed or they're responsible for their child's disability or their difficulty. What they end up doing is they try to put everything in place to make their child happy. Another kind of parenting that I see that is driven by shame is fear-driven parenting. And these are parents that come to me that themselves are highly anxious. Oh my God, Adam, I want my kid to go to university. How are they going to be independent? What's going to happen when I'm no longer around? Lots of fear about the future. And so what ends up happening with anxious parents is that they struggle to be present with their child because they're so stuck on the future. And as a result, these kinds of parents struggle to meet their child's current needs. So for example, if you have a child with a certain difficulty around, let's say, speech, a parent that has shame, that's fear-driven, might think, well, oh, how is my son ever going to speak as an adult? I'm going to force him to speak. And perhaps that child doesn't have that capacity, or the way that they're going to communicate is going to be different. But if the parent is so stuck in the future, they will miss the ability to be present with their child and meet their child's needs. And there's a paradox here in that this kind of parenting, the parent is afraid of the future. However, the way that they act today will make the future come to reality. So these are two kinds of parenting styles that I tend to see with my clients when it comes to shame. It's so important that we realize that shame is toxic. It leads to irrational decisions. And a lot of times there is blame of self or others. So shame is toxic because it becomes pervasive. It's not just about me and my son when he's tantruming. It becomes me as a parent in all aspects. What I feed my child, what I clothe my child with, which schools I send them to. Shame also leads to irrational thoughts and decisions. So for example, if I was to see my son tantrum, if I was to react from a shame-driven perspective, I may say something like, well, Adam, how could you call yourself a psychologist, yet your own son is struggling with his behavior? You got to do something about it. And so it may make me want to become more disciplinary, which is not necessarily going to be helpful. And finally, shame is not something that we want to feel or experience. And so it's like a hot potato. We want to pass it on. And so what we do with shame a lot of time is we end up blaming someone or ourselves. So for example, I see this in parents where their child has a difficulty. And so the parent will say, well, that doctor didn't help. And I took him to that psychiatrist and they couldn't help. And I tried a naturopathic doctor. Oh, and they were terrible. And I tried massage therapy and that didn't help with their motor skills. And so you end up, because shame becomes so difficult to deal with, we want to throw it onto someone else. We want to blame other people. Now that we know a little bit about shame, it's important to know it's important to talk about what we do with shame. So a lot of times I work with parents to help them identify that shame. Can you give your shame a name? What would you call it if you had to give your shame a name? For some people, their shame represents a critic in their life. For some people, they relate their shame to a character that they know in TV or in movies. Can you give a name to your shame? And the reason why it's so important to name it is because if you can't name it, you can't tame it. If I don't know it's there, how will I know what to do with it? Another important thing to consider is, what does shame feel like? For me as a parent, because every parent has shame, my shame makes me angry. For some parents, it makes them scared. And for a lot of parents, it leads to sadness. So what does shame feel like in you? And one way to answer this question is to think about a time when you reacted to your child's difficulty in a way that was not helpful. What did that moment feel like to you? Something else to keep in mind is, what does shame make you want to do? For some people, it's, I want to make my child happy. For some people, it's, I am going to make sure my child is very disciplined. It's really important that we think about how our shame impacts our behavior. It's once we have a name and we can describe the feeling of shame in us, we can begin to talk back to shame, do something about it. So I'm going to list some questions that you can ask yourself. And I understand that in the moment, it's going to be hard to do this, but this takes a lot of practice. And it's okay if now you do this retrospectively. So if you can think back about a moment that you experienced shame, I want you to try to answer these questions. At that moment, what did you need to do? Versus what thought did you have about what you should be doing? What was your current capacity? Did you really have more energy to sit there and read that book for 5 or 10 minutes longer? Or was it okay for you to say no? You know, I've done enough for my child today. A lot of times, and I'm going to be talking about this in more detail, but a lot of times the shame that we experience causes us to have irrational thoughts. So in the moment, can you challenge those thoughts and ask yourself, what evidence do I have to support that I'm a bad parent? For some people that struggle with self-compassion, which is in essence being nice to yourself, what we try to do with them is we ask them, what would you say to a friend who came to you with the exact same thought that they are a bad parent? Can you extend that compassion to yourself? If your shame is causing you, and it likely is, to have challenging distortions, can you start challenging them? Can you start challenging your all or nothing thinking? Being very black and white. Can you challenge your catastrophic thoughts, which is assuming worst case scenario? Oh my God, my son is going to have a terrible life after I'm gone. Can you challenge these thoughts? Another really prominent distortion I see with parents who have children with disabilities is mind reading. And mind reading is a distortion, so it's an irrational thought that you know what other people are thinking. Can you recognize that you're engaging in these kinds of thoughts? So cognitive restructuring is a broad tool where we work with people to help them go from an irrational thought to a more helpful and rational thought. And this is because sometimes the stress that we feel is directly a result of the way that we view ourselves or other people. And so there's something about our thinking that's impacting the way that we feel. I also want to preface this by saying, I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything. I'm not trying to pretend that there are no challenges that you're experiencing. And so it's so important that with this exercise, we're true to ourselves and we come up with statements that we believe. And we allow ourselves to continue to be or to feel angry or sad or disgusted or scared if that's how we feel, and that's okay. So I'm going to walk you through an example of how we would do a cognitive restructuring exercise. So we actually got this via one of a Smile family, I believe. They sent this in. And the context is the parent is feeling kind of guilty that they're not spending more time praying at night. But the parent also explained that they have a child with certain needs that requires them to be very present the next day in the morning. So to summarize, their initial thought around this is, I'm a terrible Muslim for not taking more advantage of Ramadan and praying during the night. Okay. So the first thing that we do is we want to list the evidence that supports that thought. And there has to be evidence. There's a reason why that thought exists. So this is things that I came up with on behalf of this parent, but these are just examples. One evidence is that they know how important night prayers are in the Ramadan, and that there's so much reward for taking part in them. Maybe another piece of evidence is that this parent has missed a lot of night prayers. And maybe for the first 20 days, they only prayed one night. So these are two very concrete evidence that supports the thought that this person has. And it's important to recognize that we don't list more distortions in our list of evidence. Which means when I think about evidence, I want real concrete evidence that no one can dispute. So it's very factual. As an example, a piece of evidence that would not be appropriate to list here is, I think my family thinks I'm a bad Muslim. While that person may have these thoughts, these are not factual. There's no way, unless the family member has told them, there's no way to know for sure that the family member thinks that they're a bad Muslim. So we can't use that as a piece of evidence. So what's evidence that does not support this thought? This parent has a child with special needs that requires them to be up early in the morning for their safety. No one can dispute that. Another piece of evidence is that night prayers are not the only way to get closer to God in Ramadan, and there are other things I could do to help me spiritually. Again, this is not something that someone can dispute. The goal is to go from this initial thought up here, that's shame-driven. So here it's, I'm a terrible Muslim, I am bad. And we want to come up with a new statement that combines this part here and this part over there. So I'll give you guys a quick moment to try to think of what that new helpful thought would be that combines both the evidence in support and the evidence that does not support the initial thought. So what could be a statement, a sentence or two that you believe that is rational, that is more helpful, that is going to tackle that shame that this person is a terrible Muslim? So this is what I came up with. While I am saddened that I'm not doing more night prayers because I know how important they are, my son needs me to be up early in the morning. I will find another way to make up for this, like reading a few more minutes of Quran or praying an additional prayer throughout the day. So I hope by doing this exercise, I've modeled that, which I think is so important, is that these new thoughts have to be thoughts that are believable. We're not making light of a situation. I'm recognizing that this parent is saddened. The goal is that by coming up with a new thought, you might feel a little bit less sad or angry or disgusted or afraid. So to wrap up, what I want you guys to keep in mind is that the more practice you have around challenging thoughts, the easier it gets. From a CBT perspective, our goal is to have our clients end up being their own therapists. And so at first, it takes a lot of effort for someone to do something like this. But with practice, this is like any other skill, it becomes easier. With practice, actually, we can skip this whole middle section. We go from this distorted thought right to the new thought. Something else to keep in mind is that your thoughts have such a big impact on your feelings, and it's so important to catch them. So for example, going back to this initial thought up here, I'm a terrible Muslim for not taking more advantage of Ramadan and praying during the night. Maybe that parent has a level of sadness that's maybe 7 out of 10. Maybe they're 6 out of 10 angry when they have that thought. Perhaps with the new thought, their sadness goes down to maybe a 4 out of 10. They're still saddened. Maybe their anger goes down to 1. And so I hope I've illustrated for you how just by changing your thought, you may have impacted your feeling. And yes, the drop in the level of sadness or anger may not always be 7 points or 6 points, but can we drop it 1 point? Will that help you lead a more rational life? So this is all I wanted to talk to you guys about today. We have a few minutes left for questions. If you guys want to pose them in the chat box, and I'll ask Sophia to let me know if there's any questions. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I hope that this presentation gave you a quick glimpse at what cognitive restructuring is about. I pray that for every parent who is struggling with keeping up with their duties, they're able to be a little bit more compassionate towards themselves. I pray that you are able to do the best you can during the last 10 days of Ramadan. Thank you so much for having me, to the Smile team. And again, thank you to the audience for attending. Assalamu alaikum.